It was never intended to be fulfilled 2,000 years later, as we are living now. Doing the third video in relation to Revelation 11 and the two witnesses. There is much debate about the two witnesses. We're going to see what the Word of God really says about witnessing. But first of all, about the people who lived at the time of Jesus. These are some of the things that he said. In relation to the Pharisees, he said to them, "For the people of Nineveh will rise up at the judgment of this generation and condemn it." Now he said that in Matthew 12:28, which was quite a period before Matthew 24, but nevertheless it does have a bearing, because Matthew 24 is all about judgment on Israel, as is Luke 21 and Mark 13. We cannot ignore those three vital chapters and understand the real meaning about them, and not relegate them to 2,000 years after Jesus spoke, as is the common practice, because that's not what he said. And he also said in Matthew 23:32, to the same people who were vipers, who were liars, who rebelled against the Word of God, who had their oral tradition. In particular, he spoke to them. But you know, because they preached such things, there were people in Israel who followed them, ordinary people. And in Matthew 23:32, he said to them, "You fill up the measure. You fill up the measure of your sin." The measure that were commenced with Abel being killed, and that went on through the Old Testament of the prophets and the holy men of God being killed. It was great sin. And Jesus said to his generation that they would fill up the measure of that sin. In other words, the total measurement of the sin by God in heaven, of the sin that began with the murder of Abel, that continued throughout the Old Testament with the murder of many, that continued until the time of Jesus Christ being killed. That sin was going to be required of that generation. And indeed the sin would be continued by the Jews towards the people of God when they killed the people of God who were around the Roman Empire, and they killed them by, in effect, complaining so much about them to the Caesars many times that the Caesars took up and killed the Christians, as well as killing them on account of the things that the Christians were refused to do that the Caesars demanded in their paganism. And so Jesus is saying this: it's going to happen in your generation. You're going to be judged in their generation. Well, the judgment came as judgment on Jerusalem, as foretold by Jesus in Matthew 24 and Luke 21. Because he said it would be in their generation. He said the people in the main would still be alive who were listening to him when he spoke from in Matthew 24 from the temple and the mountain, and Luke 21, and you will find the verses there in those chapters where he distinctly says, all these things that I have said, as he was sitting there, and as it related to the temple in Jerusalem, he said, all these things I have said, this generation will not pass away. And he was speaking to the ones of that generation around AD 33. Now a generation is around 40 years. and much persecution was concentrated against the Christians in particular under the rule of Nero the emperor, that was very fierce from AD 63. So there's your generation, and that's where we're at when we're dealing with the book of Revelation. And that's where we're at when we're dealing with the fulfillment of Matthew 24 and Luke 21 and Mark 13. It was never intended to be fulfilled 2,000 years later, as we are living now, and people everywhere are running around trying to figure out what this portends as it relates to the book of Revelation. It portends nothing. The book of Revelation was absolutely fulfilled in relation to all those prophecies that we're concerned about. Totally fulfilled, not to be fulfilled again. Now we need to realize that all these things have been continuing from not only that day, now in the whole world. Jesus was speaking to the people of the Roman Empire, and he was speaking to the people who were in Israel of that day. There were many people and many nations outside of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire only extended to around about where India is. And what about all those empires north of India? And what about the islands of the sea? And what about the empires that were in South America and North America? What about the Inca Empire, whenever it was, and so forth? There were other people living. There were people living all throughout Africa. So those other people were not being addressed when the book of Revelation was written. They didn't come into the picture, yet they existed. And we are existing today, and we're not in the picture either. But all those other people, as well as us, from the time of, you could say, Genesis 6 in particular, there has been nothing but wars, nothing but conflicts and famines and pestilences and plagues. There's been a continuation of that throughout the whole world. Read your history. Now, I'm older than most of you. I want to tell you I lived through a lot of it, even though it didn't affect me like it did the people of Europe. Millions died. 80 million were killed. And what about the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, the Jewish Bolshevik Revolution, where they killed the Tsar and his family? The Jews did that. I have books proving it. I have written, these books have not been written by Christians. They've been written by scholars. I possess them. I read them. And 60 million people were killed to 80 million people by the Jewish Bolsheviks and the Communist Party. And up to 20 million Christians were killed by them. That's great persecution. That's great trouble. Jesus was specifically addressing Israel, Jerusalem, and also the people of Rome and the Caesars. And so when he portrayed in a heavenly form as symbolism, it was to show them that he was judging Israel. And that, as is the practice in the Old Testament, when God judged Israel, over and over God judged Israel. Read your history in the Old Testament. I hope you've all read at least the Old Testament once. If you've been a Christian for a long time, you should have read it a few times through. You should know the contents, to know what the Bible is speaking about. And so Jesus was saying to Israel, this is the time of Jacob's trouble. This is the great tribulation that's coming to you. As he declared in Matthew and Luke, and he said, there'll come a time of trouble that has never come upon you. He is speaking to Israel. And a terrible time did happen, if you only care to read the history and find out what did occur during those times. And so when we consider those words of Jesus, we have to realize he is saying, I'm going to judge you. The Son of Man is coming to judge you. And he didn't come in person on the earth. He had no intention of doing that. He did it from heaven, as portrayed in the book of Revelation. But the effects were on earth. And we need to realize that the temple was doomed for destruction, as is declared throughout the Old Testament. The spiritual meaning of the temple was fulfilled on the day of Pentecost, of the Old Testament temple of Ezekiel, when the river flowed, as Ezekiel saw. That's a spiritual fulfillment. And it was the Old Testament was spiritually fulfilled from all the prophecies of the Old Testament by the prophets in a spiritual way, with the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, for instance, amongst all the natural prophecies of Isaiah in relation to Judea. It was at the time, Judah, it was taken into captivity into Babylon. And so Isaiah was one prophet who was prophesying about what would happen to the nation of Israel in the form of Judah. Well, it did happen. It all happened. It's all been fulfilled. So we need to look at what the book of Revelation really means.